Louisiana buried the Broussard file for 70 years, but the lone survivor's notes never stopped echoing. Tonight we open that box. This isn't swamp folklore, it's an investigation into how isolation sharpened into predation and why parish ledgers suddenly go blank. Stay with me, and you will see why officials chose erasure over justice. If careful dark history is your thing, please like the video and subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter. In the misty, forgotten corners of Louisiana's Bayou country, where cypress trees stretch their gnarled fingers toward a perpetually gray sky, lies a story so macabre that it has been deliberately buried by local historians and law enforcement alike. This is the haunting tale of the Broussard family, a bloodline so twisted by generations of inbreeding and isolation that they became something far more terrifying than the usual bogeymen of folklore. What occurred in the depths of the Atchafalaya Basin during the 1940s defies explanation, yet the evidence remains scattered in yellowed police reports and the whispered confessions of a single survivor. The Broussards had lived in the same remote cabin for over a century, their family tree so tangled with incestuous unions that their names formed a confusing web of Johns and Marys, each generation breeding with the next in a desperate attempt to keep their bloodline pure. The family had long since stopped interacting with the outside world, surviving on what they could hunt, fish, and grow in their small clearing. Their physical deformities were legendary among locals who occasionally spotted them at the edge of town, but the true horror of their existence was something far more sinister than their grotesque appearances suggested. In the summer of 1943, a traveling salesman named William Hartwell found himself lost in the swamplands after his car broke down. Seeking help, he stumbled upon the Broussard cabin, a ramshackle structure that seemed to breathe with an unnatural malevolence. What he discovered there would become the stuff of nightmares, though few would ever believe his story. The family had evolved beyond the normal boundaries of human society, creating their own twisted version of civilization in the depths of the Louisiana wilderness. But their isolation had bred something far more dangerous than physical deformity. It had created something that preyed upon the very concept of humanity itself. The cabin stood in a clearing surrounded by Spanish moss-draped cypress trees, its wooden walls blackened with age and neglect. Smoke rose from a crooked chimney, but the scent that filled the air was unlike anything Hartwell had ever experienced, a mixture of decay, unwashed bodies, and something else, something that made his stomach turn and his instincts scream at him to run. The windows were covered with tattered curtains, but through the gaps he could see eyes watching him, eyes that held a hunger that went far beyond the need for food. This was the beginning of one of the most disturbing cases in Louisiana's criminal history, a case that would remain classified for decades and still haunts the dreams of those who were brave enough to investigate it. What makes the story especially unnerving is not only the violence implied by the fragments of evidence, but the deliberate quiet that came after. Old case numbers disappear from ledgers. Pages in parish archives are stamped retained with no follow-up. A clerk's marginalia mentions the River family. Then the paper trail simply ends. Those who tried to talk about it, the deputy in question, a single survivor, a federal agent whose memo was never sent, agree on one point. The Broussards were not a rumor, and they were not a campfire tale. They were a closed world at the edge of the map, sustained by secrecy and terrain. Our goal is to reconstruct that world with care. Across this investigation, we will ask who the Broussards were before the horror, how a pattern of isolation narrowed into a pattern of predation, what a stranded salesman saw in a cellar he was never meant to leave, and why the state chose silence over disclosure. We will tread carefully, avoiding sensationalism, grounding each claim in records and testimony, because the story's power does not come from shock, but from the way ordinary institutions failed in an extraordinary place. If you listen closely to the landscape, the bayou itself seems complicit. Flood cycles erase tracks. Heavy air carries sound unevenly. A shout vanishes 10 yards out, while a whisper rides the water. In that acoustic fog, it is easy to feel watched. The Broussard compound, in every account, is less a house than a blind spot, visible from the tree line and somehow unseen by the law. That habit of looking away by neighbors, by officials, by newspapers, allowed the family's private rules to harden into a system. Before we go deeper into the paper trail and the survivor's statement, remember that this is not a monster story in the abstract. It is a civic story about the cost of isolation, the fragility of oversight, and the lives that fell between the cracks. The files may be yellowed, but the questions they raise about who gets protected and who disappears are uncomfortably current. If you value careful archival deep dives into dark history, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. Your support helps surface cases the record tried to bury. The Broussard family's origins, traced back to 1823, when Jean-Baptiste Broussard, a French immigrant, established a homestead deep in what would later become the Atchafalaya Basin. Cut off from civilization by miles of treacherous swampland and seasonal flooding, the family slowly began to intermarry, believing that their French heritage was too precious to dilute with outside blood. What started as marriages between distant cousins eventually became unions between siblings and then between parents and children, as the family's numbers dwindled and their genetic pool became increasingly toxic. By the 1880s, the effects of their incestuous breeding were becoming obvious. Children were born with severe physical deformities, intellectual disabilities, and strange behavioral patterns that seemed to grow more pronounced with each generation. The family's isolation from the outside world accelerated these problems, as there was no fresh genetic material to dilute the accumulating defects. Local authorities largely ignored the Broussards, viewing them as harmless backwoods eccentrics whose strange ways were simply a product of their isolation. The family's compound expanded over the decades, with new structures built from whatever materials could be scavenged or stolen from abandoned settlements. By the 1920s, the Broussard property consisted of several interconnected cabins, a root cellar that extended deep into the earth, and a barn that served multiple purposes, including housing for both animals and family members. The family had developed their own language of sorts, a mixture of Cajun French and English punctuated with grunts and gestures that outsiders could not understand. The psychological deterioration of the family paralleled their physical decline. What began as simple inbreeding depression evolved into something far more sinister as the family developed increasingly aberrant social norms. They began to view outsiders not as fellow human beings, but as resources to be exploited. The family's moral compass had spun so far from conventional human ethics that they had created their own reality, one where the strong fed upon the weak without guilt or remorse. By the 1930s, travelers who ventured too close to Broussard land began to disappear with alarming frequency, but the family's isolation and the dangerous terrain made investigation difficult. Place matters here. The Atchafalaya is not simply backdrop, it is infrastructure, an ever-shifting delta of mud, willow, and cypress, stitched together by narrow passes only those born to them can read. In the 19th century, parish lines and church records lagged behind the frontier. Priests visited irregularly. Midwives kept birth notes in pencil, surnames bent with accents and floods. In that looseness, endogamy could masquerade as necessity, and necessity as pride. Keep to our own, as one neighbor recalled, was first a fence against hunger, and only later a doctrine. Early tax rolls show a small garden, traps, a skiff, and notably, no regular commerce. They grew what they ate, traded when they must, and declined invitations to fairs and feast days. A storekeeper in Butler Rose remembered a tall man and a silent boy arriving once a season for salt and lamp oil, paying in pelts and leaving before questions could stick. This patterned selective contact, guarded silence, slowly severed the ties that check a family's worst ideas. Without outsiders to push back, tradition became policy, and policy drifted. By the time the new century arrived, the Broussard homestead had thickened into a compound. A barn doubled as shelter and smokehouse. A shallow dugout became a cellar. Paths were cut not for visitors but for evasion. Language narrowed too. Cajun French peppered with private idioms and a code of gestures that made outsiders feel clumsy. Isolation bred not only genetic risk but informational risk. Children learned too little of how other people lived and too much of how to navigate a world of scarcity by taking. Locals registered their discomfort as folklore. Hunters spoke of river lights and the quiet spot, a stretch where birds would not roost and a person felt the hair rise on the forearms without knowing why. The stories were warnings without names, and they served their purpose. Most folks turned back. A few did not. Those are the absences that later investigators tried too late to tally. Even in oral genealogies collected decades later, one hears the same forked memory. Pride in endurance, and shame in the means. Elders remembered seasons by the height of the river on a cypress trunk, by the day a bridge washed out, by a year when the marsh went quiet. In those markers, surnames repeat until they blur. Cousin becomes spouse and then becomes cousin again, and the outside world's language for kin no longer fits the inside world's practice of it. Without regular schools or parish oversight, custom became an echo chamber. The claim of pure blood was less a science than a story told to justify shrinking choices. Modern roads eventually traced the basin's edge, but they bypassed the Broussards. The rail spur stopped short. A new highway shaved hours off travel between towns, and in doing so turned the old river path into a dead end. Where infrastructure leaps, isolation deepens for those it leaps past. By the 1930s, the homestead self-sufficiency had matured into suspicion by design, a stance that saw every knock as a test and every stranger as an event to be managed rather than met. The first documented encounter with the Broussards occurred in 1937, when Deputy Sheriff James Landry was called to investigate the disappearance of 3 hunters who had been exploring the area. Landry, a veteran lawman who had seen his share of strange things in the Bayou, approached the Broussard compound with a mixture of caution and curiosity. What he found there would forever change his understanding of human depravity and lead to a cover-up that would last for decades. Landry's investigation began with a careful observation of the area from a safe distance. The compound was surrounded by an odd silence that seemed to press against his eardrums like cotton. No birds sang in the trees, no insects hummed in the air, and even the usual sounds of the swamp seemed muted and distant. As he watched through binoculars, he observed figures moving around the compound, but their movements were wrong somehow, too jerky, too mechanical, as if they were marionettes controlled by a puppeteer with a trembling hand. When Landry finally approached the main cabin, he was greeted by a man who introduced himself as Papa Broussard. The man was tall but impossibly thin, his skin hanging in loose folds over prominent bones that seemed to jut at unnatural angles. His face was a map of genetic anomalies, with eyes set too far apart, a nose that seemed to have been pressed flat against his skull, and a mouth that was too wide for his face. But it was his eyes that truly disturbed the deputy. There was an intelligence there, but it was the intelligence of a predator, cold and calculating, with no trace of human empathy. Papa Broussard claimed that he had seen no strangers in the area, and that the missing hunters must have gotten lost in the swamp and drowned. His story was consistent and plausible, and without concrete evidence of wrongdoing, Landry was forced to leave empty-handed. However, as he departed, he noticed something that would haunt him for the rest of his life: a garden behind the main cabin where vegetables grew in neat rows, but the soil was too dark, too rich, and seemed to emit a subtle, sweet odor that made his stomach churn. The deputy would later report that the plants in that garden grew larger and more vibrant than any he had ever seen, as if nourished by something far more potent than ordinary fertilizer. Landry took notes the way a man makes a map. Wind from the south, 2 chimneys, 3 outbuildings, a fence line stitched with wire of different gauges, repairs done in haste. He marked snare signs along a game trail and a scrap of cloth caught in a thorn, then scratched it out, unsure if the breeze had tricked him. He logged the absence of dogs. Most backwoods families kept hounds. The Broussards did not, and the quiet that fact produced was a kind of policy in itself. Quiet helps you hear who is coming. In his report, he wrote that the patriarch's eyes did not blink at the right times, a strange phrase for a practical man, and one that suggests how hard the encounter was to put into the language of forms. He also noted, carefully, that he was offered no water and saw no well, only rain barrels. A place that closes itself off from the water table is a place that does not want visitors lingering. Back at the sheriff's office, the file began to attract heat. A senior deputy advised Landry to let the river handle river problems, and the hunters' families were nudged toward the story of a squall and a capsized pirogue. Off the record, Landry returned alone once more and found the garden newly turned, the rows neat as before, and a length of cord half buried near the root cellar hatch. He pocketed the cord, and years later would pass it to a federal agent who filed it with other small, stubborn proofs that something systematic was happening in the swamp. When a game warden agreed to accompany him on a second formal visit, they found the yard subtly rearranged, barrels shifted, a path brushed smooth with palm fronds, prints too uniform to trust. The warden, who knew the tricks of trappers, pointed to a plank set just below the surface of the muck, its face stamped with a boot sole. It was a way to plant evidence for the eye at a glance, a decoy to lead searchers in circles. Someone on the property understood how investigators think, and how to waste their time. Landry once drafted a letter to the local paper, unsigned, describing a cultivated garden that should not be as prosperous as it is. He never sent it. The note survived in a private folder, later donated by a family member to a small historical society. It is not proof of a crime, but it is proof of a conscience, of a man who saw something he could not square with the natural order of things, and who feared what naming it out loud might loose. The truth about the Broussards' activities came to light through the testimony of William Hartwell, the traveling salesman who had stumbled upon their compound in 19... His account, recorded in a series of interviews with FBI agents in 1944, provides the most detailed look at the family's horrifying practices and the systematic way in which they had turned to cannibalism. Hartwell described the root cellar as a place of unspeakable horror, where the walls were stained with what appeared to be old blood and the air was thick with the smell of decay. The cellar was divided into several sections, one of which served as a holding area for captives, while another appeared to be a makeshift kitchen where the family prepared their meals. Hartwell was kept in the main holding area with 3 other captives, all of whom had been taken from the surrounding area over the previous months. The family's feeding schedule was methodical and terrifying. Every few days, one of the captives would be taken from the cellar and would not return. The remaining captives could hear sounds from the kitchen area, screaming that would eventually fade to silence, followed by what sounded like the methodical chopping of meat. The family would then consume their meal in the main cabin, and the sounds of their feeding were audible even from the cellar. They ate in silence, with only the occasional grunt or growl breaking the quiet, as if they were animals rather than human beings. Hartwell managed to escape during a violent thunderstorm that provided cover for his flight. He spent 2 days lost in the swamp before finding his way to a nearby settlement, where he immediately reported his ordeal to local authorities. However, by the time law enforcement arrived at the Broussard compound, the family had vanished completely, leaving behind only the evidence of their horrific practices and a root cellar that would forever remain a testament to the depths of human depravity. Hartwell's account is detailed, not because he was a writer, but because fear makes a ledger of small things. He describes how a woman with a gray braid kept the keys, and how a younger man limped on his right side. He timed footsteps with his breath, counted the intervals between lantern checks, and learned that storms changed the routine. He noticed, too, the tools near the hatch: salt sacks, wire, a roll of canvas, items that explained how the family could stretch a catch through lean weeks without relying on outside markets. He also learned the geometry of the place. The cellar bundled sound in strange ways. A whisper at the hatch would carry, but a shout into the corner died where it fell. That is how he and another captive spread news, 2 words at a time, passed to the next man along the wall. On the second night, they learned that a boat was pulled beneath the porch, half hidden by slats. On the third, thunder began before dusk. By the time he reached help, his story sounded impossible even to him. But as his strength returned, details persisted that investigators could check against their own maps. The notch on the cellar hatch, the garden rose, the false trail with footprints cut into boards to mimic boots. The plausibility of those specifics carried his account further than any speech could have, and into the hands of federal agents willing to read it without disbelief. Agents compared Hartwell's timeline to weather logs from the U.S. Weather Bureau. The storm he described struck the basin the night he claimed it did. They checked parish radio traffic for calls about a lost automobile and found a note about a salesman stranded on a levee road 2 days before his escape. A grocer's ledger listed a purchase of salt and twine consistent with Hartwell's recollection of supplies he saw stacked near the hatch. None of these items prove the cellar, but together they establish a weave tight enough to carry weight. Interviewers noted that Hartwell's phrasing remained consistent across sessions. He did not embellish. When pressed to characterize the family, he avoided labels and returned to actions: who unlocked which door, how long the ladder stayed down, when the lanterns were trimmed. Trauma does not make anyone a perfect witness, but it can make them meticulous. The FBI reports, redacted but legible in tone, read as if their authors were trying to persuade colleagues who would not be easily persuaded. If you're finding value in this careful reconstruction, please like the video and subscribe. Your support helps us surface cases the record tried to bury. The investigation that followed Hartwell's escape revealed the full extent of the Broussards' crimes and the systematic way in which they had sustained their cannibalistic lifestyle for years. The root cellar beneath their compound contained evidence of dozens of victims, including bones, clothing, and personal items that had been collected over the years. The family had developed an efficient system for capturing, holding, and consuming their victims, with each member of the family having specific roles in the process. The Broussards had apparently begun their descent into cannibalism in the late 1920s, when a combination of economic hardship and the family's increasing physical and mental deterioration led them to desperate measures. What started as the consumption of a single victim, likely a lost traveler, had evolved into a systematic practice that sustained the family for over a decade. They had learned to preserve meat using salt and smoke, and had even developed recipes that made their meals more palatable, though the ingredients remained the same. The family's hunting grounds extended for miles around their compound, and they had developed an intimate knowledge of the swampland that allowed them to predict where lost travelers might appear. They would set elaborate traps, sometimes leaving false signs or creating the appearance of civilization to lure victims to their doom. The family had become masters of deception, using their knowledge of human psychology to exploit the hopes and fears of their prey. The physical evidence found at the compound was overwhelming in its horror. The root cellar contained detailed records of the family's activities, written in a mixture of French and English in journals that had been maintained by various family members over the years. These journals described not only the family's feeding practices, but also their thoughts and justifications for their actions. They viewed themselves as superior beings, evolved beyond the moral constraints that bound ordinary humans, and saw their victims as nothing more than livestock to be raised and consumed. Investigators tried to impose order on disorder. They overlaid missing persons lists with local flood calendars, looking for windows when a stranger might wander off a road and into a trap. They sent the journals to a translator familiar with Cajun idiom, who noted that the handwriting changes but the voice does not, a ritualized we that erases the individual in favor of the family's will. Inventories, buttons, rings, initials carved into tin, were boxed, labeled, and sealed. Some boxes never reappeared. The case became a jurisdictional puzzle. Parish deputies could reach the site fastest but lacked resources. Federal agents had resources but no feel for the swamp. A joint team was assembled, then dissolved, then reassembled with different names on the letterhead. In the gaps, the Broussard's trails cooled. What had been a living system collapsed into scenes to be interpreted by people who could not agree on what they were seeing. Hartwell's testimony provided the spine for a theory of operation, a bait-and-capture corridor disguised as a neighborly shortcut, a storage routine that treated human beings as stock, a preservation practice built on salt and smoke to reduce the need for risky trips into town. None of this required elaborate tools. It required only privacy, knowledge of the terrain, and the willingness to treat other people as means. When agents returned to the cellar with better light, they found more writing etched into the wood itself, initials, tally marks, a child's attempt at a name. These scratches told the most honest story. The family believed the cellar was permanent enough to decorate. That confidence, more than any single object, convinced the sober men in suits that the horror had not been a panic or a spree, but a plan carried out over years. Search protocols widened, then narrowed. Boats dragged the edges of channels where Hartwell said he had hidden. Deputies posted notices in towns upriver, asking about drifters gone missing. A handful of responses overlapped with dates in the journals, never perfectly but too closely to ignore. A spreadsheet compiled years later by a junior analyst, yellowed now in a file box, shows clusters in the late 1930s that map cleanly onto flood seasons. Movement creates opportunity. High water brings strangers to the wrong place at the wrong time. No one could fix the number. 50 confirmed victims is a count bounded by what was found, not by what occurred. WPA workers, loggers, travelers, a man who fixed radios from the back of a truck, people who left light footprints and could vanish without setting off alarms, appear as maybes in the margins. A Freedom of Information request decades later yielded 19 pages with heavy redactions and a tantalizing reference to attachments withheld. If those attachments were ever released, they have not surfaced publicly. The aftermath of the Broussard case sent shockwaves through Louisiana law enforcement and led to a massive cover-up that kept the details of the family's activities hidden from the public for decades. The evidence was classified at the state level, and the surviving records were sealed to prevent panic and protect the families of the victims. What made the case even more disturbing was the realization that the Broussards had likely been operating for much longer than the evidence suggested, with their activities going unnoticed due to their remote location and the family's ability to dispose of evidence in the swamp. The FBI's involvement in the case was brief but intense. Agents from New Orleans were called in to assist with the investigation, but they quickly realized that they were dealing with something that defied conventional criminal investigation techniques. The family had left behind a trail of evidence that was both overwhelming and deeply disturbing, including detailed journals, preserved remains, and implements of torture that had been used to prepare their victims. The psychological profiles of the Broussards, revealed a group of individuals who had evolved beyond the normal boundaries of human society, creating their own twisted moral framework that justified their actions. They saw themselves as the natural rulers of their domain, with the right to consume those who were weak enough to fall into their trap. This belief system had been passed down through generations, with each family member learning from birth that their superiority entitled them to feed upon the weak. The case was officially closed in 1945, but not before investigators had documented over 50 confirmed victims, with the possibility of many more who had disappeared without trace over the decades. The Broussards themselves had vanished into the swamp, and despite extensive searches, no trace of them was ever found. Some investigators believed that they had simply moved to an even more remote location, while others theorized that they had died in the swamp, their bodies consumed by the same waters that had hidden their crimes for so long. Secrecy did not fall from the sky. It was argued for. Memos describe concerns about wartime morale, about copycats, about the reputations of families whose names appeared in the journals as acquaintances or cousins. A judge wrote that publication would do no good to the living and no honor to the dead. Others feared vigilantism. The decision to classify, whatever its intention, had the effect of moving grief into private rooms and leaving the public record smooth where it should have been rough. Properties associated with the compound were condemned, scraped and burned, not as evidence but as abatement. The soil turned, again and again, until nothing recognizable remained. Photographs were filed under euphemisms. Some reports carried two dates, the day they were written and the day they were allowed to be read by anyone without a badge. In those intervals, memories curdled into stories, and stories into myths, which is how the Broussards passed from the docket into folklore while their victims were still being mourned. For the people left behind, closure never arrived as a single moment. It arrived as a set of quiet accommodations, a chair left empty at reunions, a box of clippings under a bed, a habit of avoiding certain roads at dusk. For Hartwell, survival meant leaving Louisiana. He changed jobs, then towns, and when he finally sat for interviews, he seemed most shocked that someone believed him. Newspapers handled the story as a rumor to be managed rather than a scandal to be exposed. A 2-paragraph brief about disturbances near the basin ran once and never again. An editorial warned against panic over unverified tales. In private, reporters traded notes about a sheriff's office that would not return calls and a federal office that would not confirm jurisdiction. Without official statements, the press had little to print that would stand up in court, and what could not be printed did not exist for most readers. From time to time, an investigator tried to reopen the matter. In the 1960s, a retired agent wrote to the state archive requesting access to B-files he had never been permitted to see. The request was denied with a form letter. He died with 2 boxes of clippings in his attic. We know this because his daughter, decades later, donated them to a university library where a graduate student found the letter, flat and patient under a paperclip. The legend of the Broussards has persisted in Louisiana folklore for decades, with locals telling stories of strange lights in the swamp and the occasional sighting of figures that matched the descriptions of the family members. The site of their compound was eventually bulldozed and burned, but the soil remained contaminated with the evidence of their activities, and vegetation in the area grew in twisted, unnatural patterns that served as a reminder of the evil that had once flourished there. The case of the Broussard family serves as a stark reminder of the depths to which humanity can sink when isolated from civilization and moral guidance. Their story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of inbreeding, isolation, and the breakdown of social norms, but it is also a testament to the resilience of those who survived their encounters with this macabre family. William Hartwell's testimony, though initially met with skepticism, ultimately led to the exposure of one of the most disturbing criminal enterprises in American history. Today, the Atchafalaya Basin remains a place of beauty and danger, where the line between civilization and wilderness is razor-thin. The Broussard case has become part of the region's folklore, a cautionary tale told to warn travelers about the dangers that can lurk in the depths of the swamp. The family's crimes were so heinous that they forced law enforcement to confront the reality that monsters are not always the stuff of fiction. They can emerge from the darkest corners of human nature, sustained by isolation and fed by the very society they prey upon. The legacy of the Broussards continues to serve as a reminder that in the forgotten corners of our world, where civilization's reach grows thin, the most fundamental rules of human decency can be twisted beyond recognition. Their story is one of the most macabre chapters in Louisiana's criminal history, a tale of inbred cannibals who operated in the shadows of society for decades before their activities were finally exposed. Though the family itself has vanished into the mists of the swamp, their legend endures as a testament to the darkness that can flourish when humanity turns its back on the light of civilization. Folklore fills the gaps the record leaves. Airboat guides tell of a dead patch where sound seems to land wrong. Fishermen avoid a bend not for ghosts but for the way the current clocks their skiffs sideways. A few thrill-seekers go looking at night and return with camera rolls of fog. Those stories are not evidence, but they are proof of memory, of a community's instinct to mark a wound, even when the scar has been landscaped over. If there is an ethical demand on anyone telling this story today, it is to resist turning the Broussards into a spectacle and instead to remember the people who vanished on their way to work, to hunt, to sell a repair, to see a friend. The case is not a campfire tale to pass a night. It is a test of whether we can hold discomfort long enough to honor those who were lost without pretending the world that produced their loss is gone. There are small ways to make that memory useful. Support the local archives that keep fragile records alive. Press for open records where secrecy serves only inertia. Listen to communities when they tell you where the map feels wrong. Darkness thrives in neglect. The more we know, the fewer blind corners the future can hide in. Calls to unseal the remaining files are less about spectacle than about recognition. Names matter. Timelines matter. The discipline of knowing exactly what happened is a way of preventing the easy slide into legend, where accountability fades and only the shiver remains. If there is a lesson here, it is not that monsters lurk in swamps. It is that isolation and impunity make ordinary people capable of organizing cruelty and then teaching it as a family craft. If this kind of carefully sourced dark history matters to you, subscribe and turn on notifications. Share this case with someone who thinks the past is settled, and tell us in the comments which buried file you want us to open next.